Welcome to Foreign Countries, Conversations in Archaeology with me, Ash Lenton. This episode is all about early medieval cemeteries in England, commonly known as early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries. My guest today is Professor Duncan of the University of Central Lancashire, who very recently published his book, Early Anglo-Saxon Cemeteries, Kinship, Community and Identity. Duncan's book is a huge survey of published work, put together with his own extensive research over the last 15 or 20 years, and it is available open access on the Manchester University Press website. So welcome back, Duncan. You've been working and publishing on early medieval cemeteries for many years now. I know you've been working on this book for a long time. What did you set out to achieve?
So it's sort of interesting to think of it as a book, because that is the product of it. But it started life many, many years ago as an essay I wrote my master's degree. And I realized that it wasn't possible to understand cemetery space in a small way. So I turned it into a PhD. I looked at 9 cemeteries. I wasn't overly satisfied with that. It didn't really answer the questions I had. So I had to make it into a much bigger project to manage that. And so the book really is an attempt to deal with that in a much more substantive way. And so I look at 110 cemeteries and the internal organisation of those cemeteries and the different patterns of it. What I'm trying to do with it is to try and understand the phenomenon of early Anglo-Saxon burial, but funerary archaeology also more generally, as an extremely regional process. We tend to talk about things in very large scale. So we talk about the Anglo-Saxons and the way of Anglo-Saxon death. But in reality, each burial is made by a group of actors who are unique to that burial. And the next one will be made by a completely separate group of actors, some of which may have been at the previous one, but many won't. And so each event, each archaeological context has been constructed in a completely new fashion, using the series of cultural and chronological tools available to people there. And so what I'm trying to do is sort of frame these particularly interesting cemeteries. And the reason they're interesting from a funerary perspective is that they have quite a large number of grave goods and good preservation of skeletal remains. So you can combine objects and osteoarchaeology together to create a much more detailed picture to allow a sort of multi-layered interpretation. But if we understand them then as a local chronological context, then we have to accept that there's massive variation within the range of possible expressions in each individual rite. So then how can we compare and cross-compare within cemeteries and across cemeteries to understand that sort of narrative, really? And really, I suppose at that level, we're doing what we always claim to do with archaeology, which is get down to the local stories, the individual stories, the people, the actors who make the archaeological record.
110 cemeteries is a huge undertaking. So do you see it as a very small scale analysis as well?
In many ways, that's the reverse, I guess, of what we're trying to do. We talk big picture stuff. We talk about the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, migration, identity, that sort of stuff. But maybe it's time to start thinking about the individuals as well. So that's what this book is really trying to do, to look at individuals and their contribution to a broader cultural zeitgeist of early medieval England.
So you have a number of strands of inquiry, and I want to talk through those with you. But as a starting point, you have a particular view of cemeteries, don't you?
Yeah, there's loads of ways you could go about trying to understand cemetery space, organisation of mortuary environment, your micro-landscape perspective, all that sort of thing. But one of the things that strikes me about this particular cultural context is that they're using it to tell stories. The cemetery space is a physical representation of community history. And one of the things that we have with our community histories and our cemeteries are very good records and archives that you can go through and look at names and dates of death and this kind of stuff. Exactly the same sort of thing is taking place, but in a physical and material way in the 5th, 6th and 7th centuries AD. So as a metaphor, and I'm not the only person who's ever used this metaphor, but I think it's a very powerful one, talk about writing cemetery space as writing histories and telling stories.
Yeah, so the cemetery as a storytelling device. Okay, so in terms of cemetery and grave organisation, you talk about the syntax of space, so the spatial relationships.
What I'm trying to do that really is introduce the cemetery space and look in detail at the individual components that structure it. So, for example, orientation of grave, east-west, north-south, the comparative orientation of graves, location of pre-existing features, Roman ditches, Bronze Age barrows, look at the presence of different clusters of graves and use statistical approaches in an attempt to divide those up and see what patterns start to appear. So really that's setting the scene as a context of the ritual and the space, exploring the difference between cremation and inhumation in terms of how it applies to cemetery space. And the answer often is very different in each cemetery. Those tools being used differently to express different aspects of community identity or individual identity in each space.
And moving that on, those relationships, as you say, were designed over space and over time.
So the next strand, as you're describing it then, is mortuary meter. And I've already alluded to the fact that chronology is extremely important here, because the chronological context, what's available to you at the point of you are designing your friend, your family member's burial, is absolutely critical to what's going into it. So it might be that in the mid-6th century, for example, there are not as many weapons as there are in the early 6th century and the later 6th century. So it may not be something that you would choose automatically to brace into a grave. So that chronological context matters quite significantly. And the mortuary meter, talking about that time, if you like, the pulse, the change, the rhythm of mortuary practice, as part of that storytelling, the meter of poetry or the meter of music talks about that sort of shift and change from generation to generation, those reinterpretations of the ritual, who's alive to be participating in it, who's creating it, what that means. Perhaps you've got plots, groups of burials that are prominent at one point, then die back, and then come back again later, and other ones that appear and disappear. So trying to look in detail at the chronological development of sites. Some cemeteries, it turns out, are organised chronologically and others not. And so it's quite an important way that people hang the narrative onto that space. And what I think comes out of that chapter, what I hope comes out of that chapter quite prominently, is that different groups burying in a single cemetery will actually treat time differently, and they will approach it differently. So many sites like Appledown, for example, there's a core of burials right in the middle of it, buried on east-west orientation, which I've already established as significant in the syntax of cemetery space. And those individuals have most of the grave goods in the cemetery, certainly the ones that you would consider to be Anglo-Saxon in their type. They also are buried on top of each other over time in a tight cluster. So they're constantly returning to that space, generation after generation after generation after generation throughout the use of the cemetery. The surrounding burials, which are much more loosely spaced, don't do the same thing at all. First off, they have smaller numbers of grave goods, often a bead or a buckle or occasionally a small spearhead. But those are buried in a way that appears to go clockwise around that centre. Starting off, difficult to identify the first burial, but starting off probably at 12 o'clock and then just moving around all the way until the cemetery finishes. And so what you've got there is two completely different attitudes towards the use of space and time within that space. And so that's one of the things I start to bring out in that meter chapter, that sort of rhythm. If you approach space in one way, it shows you have a particular attitude towards the narrative device that you're using versus using space in the other way.
I've always been interested in those grammatic arrangements, the palette of choices, and you use the concept as the grammar of the grave.
Taking that idea and starting to look at what's inside the grave, what is it that people are actually placing in there, how they're constructing that individual funeral narrative, the artifacts, positions of bodies, and trying to look then at how different narratives start to appear and be used in different ways by different groups. And we're setting up the 5th chapter, imitation of the individual, as a way to say, well, actually, if we combine artifacts and skeletal material together, perhaps we can start to see those attitudes also reflecting lifeways. So, for example, one of the things that I'm able to discuss in detail is height or stature. And it turns out that people with greater stature, men in particular, with weapons with more stature, are buried in slightly different places in the cemetery to other people. So perhaps this is to do with biological affinity, their closeness biologically to other groups. So maybe what we can start to point to is that these different attitudes in the graves, in the cemetery spaces, are down to family groups with different approaches to the mortuary space. Wakeley, for example, if we keep on the individual artifacts, we've got a cluster of burials to the west-hand side, which have type 2 belt buckles, which have got a backplate on them. What they're doing there is using aesthetically visible material culture to express a particular type of burial. You could call it wealth if you want, but I think aesthetic works better because it doesn't place a value judgment on it. But they're creating a burial that looks like a particular thing. And you can see this time and time again at various places where you have a burial tradition that continues in particular clusters of graves over generations. And it might be the presence of small artifacts like pins or buckles, or it might be the whole aesthetic device of the burial all the way through, where things are placed and how they're laid out. But it appears to be something that is taken on board generation by generation. Maybe it's passed down between the people who prepare the grave, or maybe it's just the memory of how the grave was set up, that sort of mnemonic. And it's interesting that when you start to isolate groups within those, so for example, I used male weapon burials at West Heselton in Yorkshire, in a T shape in the middle of the largest plot, are all the same sort of stature within 2 or 3 centimetres of each other, which is an astonishing thing, really, when you start doing that. If you looked at all weapon burials, and this is a thing that we normally do in archaeology, to take a category across the whole cemetery, all weapon burials, then the stature varies massively. But if you start isolating areas of the cemetery and looking at those, or particular types of ritual, multiple weapons in the central plot, they're all very similar. Interestingly then, women in that same plot with grave goods are not particularly similar. But in one of the more widely distributed burial areas to the north, it's the women without artifacts are much more close in stature than the women with artifacts or the men with artifacts.
And what do you make of that?
I think, and I've got you can sort of explore this with teeth data as well, and I've got a PhD student who's recently completed looking in really good detail at teeth metrics and biodistance similarity between individuals. And I think what we managed to do in the book and what she's managed to do in her PhD is to think about that sort of similarity between people. It looks to us like we've got in the wealthier burials, and those aesthetically more material burials, you have males showing male locality. You're more likely to have generations of men who are similar. Whereas in the individuals which have less aesthetic significance placed on their burials, you have maternal or matrolocality. So women are more likely to be staying where they are. And it might be that what we're starting to see towards the late 6th and 7th century is the emergence of the elite Anglo-Saxon family as a local phenomenon, starting to say, well, we are the Anglo-Saxon elite. This is it's almost like a proto-manor, and we're starting to associate identity with family membership and starting to use that family space, that cemetery space, to mark out that constant chronology, that legitimization of the elite family. So that's what I think we're starting to see, where patrolocality starts to become important. Women are moving into that space to marry. It's the male that's remaining and inheriting the land and continuing that tradition.
And you're saying that's localized, it's not necessarily a general pattern?
That's not happening amongst all groups. And that's the point, isn't it? Different clusters, different areas. Perhaps there are different types of ways of living in family groups that are different amongst, well, you could say, we could use an old term like social economic difference, or you could say attitude differences among different family groups, which have different functions within society. Those cemeteries, like, for example, Appledown, where we've got that cluster around the site, skeletally, those individuals are more likely to have trauma or damage, for example, osteoarthritis or breakages to their bones, than the people in the middle. But the people in the middle often live longer. So it suggests that we've got different life ways, different people having exposure to more damage, exposure to more trauma, but also choosing not to place so much emphasis on a continuous male line. So perhaps also seeing the emergence then of, well, I hate to say the word class attitude, but really that's the implication. Class is obviously the wrong way to think about it, but different ways of thinking about your family, different ways of thinking about your life, starting to be expressed within single spaces. We often compare different cemeteries or different regions. But what I'm saying in this book is very much we should be looking internally to see the differences in attitude that are being expressed within the cemetery itself.
So it was just some clusters that were doing this at first. So where else was this expression more prominent?
And certainly bigger sites like Dover Buckland, which I go into, based on the new chronologies that John Hines has published, and revisit that material culture in line with carbon dates. You can really see that some plots in that massive cemetery become prominent at different times. And perhaps what we can start doing at sites like that is to write family histories a little bit more into the narrative. The thing that we've learned very much from mortuary archaeology is that dead don't bury themselves. But in that case, it's this family that does. And that kinship element, that family element, is something that's been missing from archaeological narrative. And yet really it is the glue that moves society on. It should be the core of social archaeology. Family identity is one of the most significant things that structures our life. We need to understand how people look at it and how they understand it and what their attitude towards it, to understand how culture is transmitted, to understand how gender is expressed. For example, in this space, in these cemeteries, it seems to be those individuals who have most aesthetic interest in central burial areas, in more elaborate burial material, that express difference in gender. You don't see that in other areas of the cemeteries. So perhaps gender expression in early Anglo-Saxon mortuary ritual is isolated to that elite local family and not to that broader cross-spectrum of society. And that's really important to understand what gives you the freedom to express your gender, or what makes it an imperative in your life. Perhaps it's the fact that mobility through marriage is such an important part of how that particular core family mitigate their movement through the world. Nobody else is doing that. They're all sort of marrying whoever, or not bothering to marry, or moving around. And perhaps it's the women who are remaining local for work, much more freedom, much more flexibility in that sense. And perhaps men and women doing similar sorts of work. But that core elite family are the ones that are saying, this is the way that men are buried, and this is the way that women are buried. And so gender identity, the aesthetics of space and the aesthetics of that martial versus practical elements or dress, extremely important amongst that group of people who return to their burial space over and over and over and over again. So really with this book, I'm trying to write a much more holistic and complex narrative that really gets down to these local and individual histories.
I'm thinking now in terms of paradigms and how to approach this material from now on. Is it really still possible to think about regional cultural patterns?
Yeah, so 110 cemeteries, because they're well-published examples that can be explored in some considerable detail. But to answer your question properly, we have to understand a little bit about the history of the subject. And really, there are two approaches in the past to Anglo-Saxon cemetery spaces. There are scholars like Heinrich Herke or Nick Studley or Howard Williams have looked at national samples to answer big questions like weapon burials or gender and female graves or memory or reuse of monuments. And then there's a slightly different approach. People like Sam Lucy, who wrote her thesis on the burials of East Yorkshire. And there's a number of people going right the way back to Tanya Dickinson or Martin Welsh, who looked at Thames Valley or Sussex. And so you either have that sort of regionality where you start to create a local chronology and understand a local phenomenon as an entity, or you start to ask national questions. What I'm trying to do with the book really is to build on those two perspectives and build a national database, if you like, or a national sample set to understand local phenomenon. Because actually, even if you go to somewhere like East Yorkshire, individual cemeteries are very different to each other, and the different patterns in those cemeteries are quite different. So although there are clearly things that are favoured in some regions to others, in Kent, for example, there are lots more garnet disc brooches or swords, artefacts imported from the continent, from Merovingian France. Whereas in Yorkshire, you have more crouched burials, more burials on the side, more variation in the physical space. So there's definitely regional phenomena that take place. But that's part of the cultural set available to those individuals. The cemetery design itself is still a very local phenomenon. And so really what I want to do is sort of step away from those and start to look at individual sites as the point at which we should investigate these spaces. Yes, we need to understand them in their national set. Yes, we need to understand them in their as the product of regional cultural influences. But we also need to understand them as deeply local and deeply personal places.
110 cemeteries, a lot of graves. And given the various strands of inquiry that you've been following, what is it that you can really understand now that you hadn't, say, in previous papers, for example?
I'm building on some papers I've published in the past. A methodology paper dealing with spatial statistics, but looks at 3 sites. And so really, to understand that and use it properly, you have to understand the whole phenomenon. So by applying that to a whole load of sites, actually new factors come to play and start to become evident. For example, actually burial plots, not the only way of organising the physical space of the cemetery. Whereas obviously the methodology paper, which looks at spatial statistics, focuses entirely on that one phenomenon. There are plenty of other ways of doing it as well, which don't rely on that spatial placement. Perhaps it's about the density of burials or other things, the use of cremation versus inhumation, for example. And while I do talk a little bit about, I've published a paper on infant mortality and mobility, and I do talk a little bit about that in the paper, it's very much in that broader context. Each of those pieces is a smaller piece of the puzzle that adds to the bigger picture that is the book as a phenomenon. And so really what you can see is it is the product of over 10 years worth of thinking. Those new methodologies and approaches were developed for the book, for the continuing narrative. And really, the papers are a spill-off from the book rather than the book being something else. The single most important contribution to this, really, was excavating at Oakington, early Anglo-Saxon Cemetery. Before then, you're sort of playing with it, writing, thinking about something. But the thing that really changed my perspective completely, and is really ends up being the core factor in this book, comes from physically experiencing the excavation, physically experiencing the grave. And the reason for that, and the reason I think I end up emphasizing the very local, very personal experience of these things, is that archaeologists have to climb into the grave to excavate the dead. We have to be part of it, really. You have to excavate with your trowel, with your leaf trowel, with your toothpick, if you've got one, or your lolly stick. You have to very carefully lift the artifacts. You're spending quite a long time there. Oakington, we would spend up to 10 hours excavating a single grave. And so you end up developing a particular perspective. And the last people who did that were the Anglo-Saxons who buried the people. And we tend to draw reconstruction drawings these days to try and explore the context of it, don't we? Something Howard Williams talks about in various papers. But one of the problems with those is that they're all like Anglicans. They're all sort of standing slightly apart in their best dress, maybe showing a little bit of emotion, but all standing quite rigid. But actually the mortuary space can't be like that, because you've got someone who's died, the body needs to be prepared. They then need to be transported to a grave that's been physically excavated. And to lower their body into the grave, you've got to climb in there with them. And then you've got to rearrange the body, and you've got to rearrange the clothing, and then you've got to put artifacts in there. You're not throwing them in like a wishing well, you're laying them next to the person. So you're physically intertwining with that mortuary context of becoming part of it. You're telling stories while you're doing it. You're not doing it by yourself. You're doing it with a community of people. There's a really nice example from Oakington. Individual woman with a baby in the grave, or a child in the grave, and she's buried face down. Okay, you think, okay, well, if you take a step back and you think about this as a photograph or a plan, it looks like a prone burial, a deviant burial. When you start looking at the details, the climbing in the grave part, her hand comes underneath her chest and it holds her beads. She's not wearing them. Someone put them in her hand and closed her hand around it. That's quite an emotive thing to do. Some other people would have probably been party to that and would have known that. The other thing that's quite important is her left hand comes underneath her sort of abdomen and touches the hip of the child. Now, if you imagine the deviant burial interpretation, that would tend to suggest some sort of violence. That's a very delicate touch, really much more emotive than that. Her wrist clasp, and we're very lucky that in that cemetery they were wearing wrist clasps, is actually further along than her hand. So it suggests that the same person or group of people that placed that hand on the hip of the child also pulled her sleeve along, effectively to conceal it from everybody else. So now you can start to see the grave as multi-layered. Small group of people laying out that particular body, positioning her in the grave, positioning her body, moving her hands around, and also hiding and concealing them from people who are not taking part in that level of ritual, those people who are standing slightly off, just observing from a distance, or who come there later. So there are little stories taking place at a very localized level between individuals who are recreating those social bonds through the preparation of those burials. Of course, at the same time, they're covered in mud. Again, they're interacting with themselves and each other, and soil and grass and all of those things. And yet we still draw the illustrations of these sort of stick figures standing slightly apart. Much more emotion, much more interaction. And that's something I really took from the initiations at Oakington, because we used to teach students. So you've got 3 or 4 people working on a grave, and it becomes a joint exercise. One person directing, others following, chatting, experiencing the thing together and learning from each other and really bonding as a team. And then you split them up and move on to the next excavation. And they use some of the knowledge they've gained from that one to lead the next group, and so on and so forth. So really, actually, you could use the excavation of those graves as a direct metaphor to understand the cutting of the grave in the first place and the laying out of a body.
So these ideas and this research, what new avenues do they open up for you? Where do you go next with this?
So what am I doing next? And this is a huge exercise, this book. I had to get it out of my head because I wasn't unable to move on from it. It was just sort of existing in my head and needed to be written and expressed so that I could build on it in terms of interpretation, in terms of exploring the Anglo-Saxon context. One of the things that I've done in this book very much, as I hope has come across, is talk about the local phenomenon, the individual, and start, and it really is only a start, to talk about that sort of biodistance, family, kinship thing. And I think you can do that using teeth metrics, and I think you can do that using stature. And we can support that at the moment with ongoing research into ancient DNA. But at the moment, the ancient DNA work we have is also focused on migration and identity. And so what we're doing really is trying to set the scene for a broader conversation that can use new scientific data to support a complex conversation about kinship. For example, biology is not the only phenomenon in kinship. Fictive kinship is a really important part of what social anthropologists also describe. So if we're going to start having an ancient DNA conversation about who is and who isn't related to each other in the cemetery, and the lab I'm working with has told me last week that they're developing methods to start looking at beyond the 1st and 2nd degree kinship, which is fabulous. If you do that, we can start to see who in a cemetery is related to each other over multiple generations. I mean, that's amazing. Who are second cousins. That's absolutely brilliant in terms of understanding this as a local phenomenon. So I think that's very much where I would like to see this work contributing, where my own work is certainly going. At the moment, I'm interested in the huge diversity that's going into biological identity in Anglo-Saxon England. And we've got individuals from quite surprising places. We have individuals from the cemeteries I'm talking about in this book coming from West Africa, for example. We can prove biologically a connection to France and across the whole of the UK. And really identify first-generation immigrants versus indigenous individuals, but start to bring that into this complicated picture, this complicated local phenomenon. So really, it turns out, hardly a surprise, is it? Because why should the past be simpler than the present? The past is really complicated, and the expressions of identity are really complicated. So this book is really the stepping stone to which to have a much nicer conversation, I think, around that material.
And how do you want to see your contribution developed? Where do you want to see the discipline going from here?
How do I want people to develop this book? How to use it? Well, the first and most important lesson, I think, of it, that I had to learn myself, is that we have to make serious concessions to the archaeological record when we're making interpretation. We tend, as archaeologists, to be driven by the survival, even subconsciously. So, for example, if you're looking at isotopes in an early Anglo-Saxon cemetery, the temptation is to say people with weapons have these types of isotopes and people without weapons have these types of isotopes. But that division is artificial, and it's based on the material culture, and it's based on the archaeological view and not on the contextual view. It would be much more successful, as I show in the book, to say these individuals with weapons and these individuals with weapons have these isotope signatures, and these people without weapons have these ones. So combine multi-layers. Don't just go, the material culture and the skeletal archaeology say this. Well, actually, what about the space and the chronology as well? And one of the reasons why those types of scientific investigation haven't really worked in this period in the past is exactly that. You're taking a cross-section across a whole cemetery or multiple cemeteries and assuming that just because individuals have a particular type of material culture, they are in some way the same. In fact, they're not. Space is much more important and chronology is much more important. And then material culture sits on top of that. So what I really want to see is people who do that sort of work, bioarchaeologists, osteoarchaeologists, working alongside people with really detailed chronological and contextual information to develop methods that actually reflect the type of data that we're working with, the context. So that's really what I think should be, for me at least, the starting point of the book. And I'm able to demonstrate there are patterns in the biodata which haven't been seen before, simply using the same data, by breaking them out in slightly different ways and approaching them in slightly different perspectives.
Yeah, I think that multidisciplinary approach is something we'd like to see. Thank you very much for joining me today, Duncan Sayer.